stood out, we could talk about for a long time, I'm sure. I'll call it a gambit, a phone call gambit, a conversation you were brokering between Tamim and MBS, and that you just kind of went with your gut on something to try get things going in the right direction. Can you tell that specific story? Because again, as I read the book, that was one that, I don't know, it just seems so emblematic of so many things about you.
That was actually one of the hardest deals that didn't get a lot of coverage because it happened really at the end of the Trump administration. And we got it signed on January 5th, which meant that it got overshadowed by other events. But basically, in our first year, Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, Egypt, and Bahrain blockaded Qatar. And it was a rift over differences that they had, but they basically stopped anything going into the country. So, I mean, one of the extraordinary stories in Qatar is they had a bunch of businessmen who they couldn't get milk because they used to buy all the milk from Saudis. They literally flew cows in from America and then started a milk business. Now they have like a massive milk business there. But it was really dire, and it was a very nasty conflict between the countries. And these guys are all close in that regard, but it was very, very nasty. And they were working at cross purposes, which really hurt our ability to make a lot of progress. The reason I got into it was basically because in my conversations with Saudi, they said that they couldn't normalize with Israel until the issue with Qatar was resolved. And so I got into that very aggressively at the end. I was with MBS when I was working with him to try and get his clearance for Bahrain to join the Abraham Accords. And at that meeting, I said, well, do we want to get this thing resolved with Qatar? And he says, yeah, absolutely. I really do. And I have a proposal that we're going to send to the Kuwaitis. I said, well, look, I'm going to see Tamim tomorrow in Qatar. Why don't I just take it? Let me bring it to him. I'll save you the postage stamp. So he says, no problem. He gives me the proposal. He has them bring it to me. And I go over to see Tamim the next day. And I say, look, I have a proposal from MBS. I read it. I don't think it's perfect. There's a couple things I would change, but I think it's legit. And I think we can get this thing done. And so Tamim very wisely said to me, does MBS really want to do this, or is this a game? And I said to him, no, I promise you. He says, Jared, you know him better than anyone. Do you think he actually wants to get this done? I said, yeah, I'm pretty confident he wants to get this done. And he really wants to bring a resolution here. So Tamim says to me, well, how do you propose we proceed? I said, well, should we just call him? Let's get him on the phone. He said, no, I don't want to call him. We spoke 2 years ago and it didn't end very well. He put out a statement after that was conflicting with our statement. I'm in a very strong position now. I don't want to set it back and do that. So he said, but if there was a phone call and we agreed to proceed on this paper, how would you suggest doing it? And I said, look, I think the real secret is we have to get his brother involved, KBS, who's, I think, very, very talented. And if he would agree to have him involved, your foreign minister, Mohammed, who's now the prime minister, I think is one of the most talented diplomats I've ever worked with. I said, I think between them, I could moderate the channel and I think we could get it done. So he says, will MBS do it? I said, well, let me call him. So I literally leave the royal room and I go into his conference room and I call MBS. And I said, look, are you okay if Khalid works on this channel with them? And he says, yeah, absolutely. No problem. Whatever you think. So I said, just hold on 1 second. So I go back in. I say, Tamim, I literally have him on the phone. Let me just bring him in here. And he says, Jared, I said, just let me put him on the phone. He says, okay. So I go in, I take my iPhone, I put it on speaker and I say, look, I've got 2 guys on the phone who really like each other a lot, but we have a little issue we got to get over. And then they start talking for like 10 minutes in Arabic and it's on speakerphone, but I don't understand a word of Arabic. Tamim hangs up the phone after and I said, well, was that a good call or a bad call? And he looks at me and he says, that was a great call. And he said, the reason this has been so hard is because we like each other so much. And it's a shame we brought our countries into this. And after that, we started negotiating back and forth on the agreement. And we had the whole bunch of roadblocks. I mean, this deal, I have 10 other stories as how it died, a million times. And it was very high paced because a lot of people on both sides were just very afraid and there was no trust. And so the only trust that existed was my trust with each side. And it's funny because at that point, I wasn't as close with the Qataris because they saw me as closer with the Saudis and the Emiratis. But through that time, I mean, Sheikh Mohammed, who's now the prime minister, I spoke to him every day, about 3 times a day for 100 days straight. And I found him to be just an incredibly straight shooter, very creative. And he really was helpful towards trying to navigate through all the different challenges that everyone who didn't want to get the deal done was throwing at us. It was just one of these things where it was like old school deal making, which probably didn't follow any diplomatic protocol that I didn't know existed. But it led to that breakthrough and ultimately that got done. And it's funny because you leave government, you go into the private sector. I remember about a year and a half later, I was flying into Qatar to see some friends and I landed and I saw a big Saudi plane there. I guess MBS was there having a meeting with Tamim. And I was kind of looking at it and I was like, you know what? That wouldn't have been here if I didn't do that call. It was just one of these things where you just feel good about the fact that the world is a little bit different because of the efforts you made. And Today, the relationship between Saudi and Qatar is phenomenal. The relationship between Qatar and UAE is phenomenal. And all these countries, instead of working against each other, are now working in collaboration with each other on the things that matter. And I think that for the sake of the Middle East, that's such a